I got my start with all things Agile when I was at Microsoft. I was at HQ in Seattle for about 20 years. About halfway through that, I started getting introduced to Kanban and I got introduced to Scrum very badly, but that's a story for another day. But when I finally started to figure out what this was all about, I found it was the most amazing thing in the world because I realized that work didn't have to hurt, that people sharing opinions was something that we wanted to make sure was happening, and it just wasn't. I had so many jobs. I loved what I did as a web dev and a website manager and an international web manager, but it just wasn't good enough until I found agility. And then as I moved to Australia, I realized things were so far behind where I was, but things slowly but surely started to get better. And then I ended up working with a couple of different big consultancies that I will not name. And things went really, really sideways. And it broke my heart because there I was finding people that we were supposed to be helping, and they were hurting and they were sad and they didn't want Scrum and they didn't want Kanban and they didn't want Agile and they didn't want to hear about XP. They were miserable. And after a particularly bad client at a particularly bad company that I hope I never have to go back to, I sat down at my desk and I started writing a new blog post called Tales from a Tired Agile Coach. And it went on for so long that I realized no one was ever going to read it. So I started chunking it down into little tiny bits, and I started throwing bits and pieces of it out with the hashtag Stop Bad Agile. And then at a certain point, I was at a conference and someone said, your content's cool and all, but you need some visuals. And I'm thinking, I'm not an artist. I have no idea what to do. But I realized I had an iPad and I realized there was something called Procreate. And I thought, you know what? I'll explore this. I'll play around with it. Let's see what I can do. And this happened. This wasn't the first bird. In fact, the second one will be the first little guy I ever drew. But when I started working on the book, huh? Oh, there was something in the background.
Station.
What I realized is you can't buy an Agile transformation. It's not a thing. There's no box of Agile that you can buy. This was my first little guy. There is no Agile op model. If there was an Agile op model, there would be a book about it. There would be videos about it. Everyone would install it and everything would be right in the universe. Only we all know that's not the case. And there is no Agile playbook. Every time I go into a company, one of the first things they say is, "You're going to sit down and write us a playbook so we can do this without you." And I'm going, but no, this took years and years and years and different types of business experience and understanding people and understanding learning and all sorts of other things have played into what we do as Agile people. And there's no substitute for it. It's got to be hands-on. It's got to be co-built. There's no such thing as an agile transformation roadmap. I can't tell you how many companies I've worked with. They waltz into a company, they throw a roadmap down with little milestones that their people are going to, you know, do. It's got nice little timelines, and lo and behold, within 18 months, your company's going to be agile. Oh, this is another good one. Using an agile framework doesn't guarantee agility. I've been so many places where people tell me, oh, our tech teams have been agile for years. They've been doing Scrum forever and a day, and we're just so agile. And you go in and you realize they've been using Scrum, they've been going to the meetings and doing 2-week increments, only they have no idea what their metrics mean. They have no idea what needs to be improved. They haven't changed a single thing. It's just the hamster wheel of Scrum, and it breaks my heart. Oh, another fantastic one that they love to throw at us is that this is something that can be managed. You can manage your way into an agile rollout. Only agility isn't about rolling something out and doing things to be agile. It's understanding who people are, how they got into the work situations that they did to begin with, and figuring out where it hurts and being able to help them. This sweet bird was actually one that I photographed while at a conference in Kuala Lumpur. So this started out as one of my photographs. Sorry about that. Somebody tries to bring you a scaling framework before they have any idea what you do, the complexity of your work, the types of people that you have, the things that you do, the culture of your business. There's no way that this can ever possibly lead to agility. Another good one, and you're going to see this one happening around the world. People are selling op models that claim that you have to, say, do only 2 week iterations. They don't even bother calling it Scrum half the time because they know it's not. But sometimes they'll throw in Scrum Masters. But then they tell you you need hundreds of Agile coaches and hundreds of Scrum Masters. Although, if you look around, there are no companies that have that many people. So, how can people coach what they don't know? How can Scrum Masters be masters of something they've never experienced? And how are you ever going to have that many of them? Around the world, I see companies all the time lately saying, oh, we just laid off thousands of people. We laid off all of our Agile staff. But if you dig a little deeper, they didn't really have any Agile staff. And we'll talk about that a little more as we go. Op models mandate the same exact roles that have to be filled by every single team and every single group, and rearrange your groups into whatever new fancy word they've decided. There's never going to be any agility because, again, if you don't co-create the system of work, if you don't co-create your op model, it's not going to get you anywhere. I love mandating compliance. Have you ever noticed that a lot of things like agile maturity models will be, are teams doing the things? Are they ticking the boxes? Are they going to the meetings? Are they going to the ceremonies? Anything, anything that's mandated in agility is just wrong. This was another fantastic one. I worked for a company that had actually been doing really well for a couple of years. They had a lot of people dealing with experiments. There was a culture of learning. Nobody ever skipped the monthly event where they brought someone in to teach them something new from whatever it was that the group decided they needed. But a lot of times these consultants will come in and they form transformation teams, and they call them things like command centers or control towers. Once you've got those kind of words in place, no Agile is ever going to have a hope of surviving, because Agile can't survive in a command and control world. Agility is about being nimble. Agility is about looking at the information you have and being able to change on a dime depending on what your customers or your tech environment, or as we saw with pandemic, what the world throws at you. You can't do that in a command and control environment. If someone tells you to reorganize your teams, restructure your teams, force your teams to be smaller, create nothing but Scrum teams, whatever it is, and they're basing it on something they claim has worked in another company, it can't work. More often than not, I go in and I see people who have absolutely no business being 2 week Scrum teams due to the nature of their work, the skills that they have, the tech that they have, and they wonder why they're struggling with it. And it's the saddest thing because they're like, well, the company came in and they told us how to reorg. And it was like, but did anybody stop to think that behind a reorg are people who maybe didn't want to leave the teams that they were on before, who maybe worked better as a 15 or 20 person team than they are as a 6 or 7 person team? That's never really taken into account. So if it's based on something that's been done before, if it's in a slide deck, if it's on a map, and they haven't actually sat down with the people who were in this to try to figure out how you should be restructured, it's just going to cause pain. One of the most heinous things to happen in a world where people originally didn't think Kanban was even remotely associated with Agile, somehow we ended up with scaling and scaling frameworks as a thing. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't have a solid Agile foundation, you don't have anything to scale. If you build a house on a broken foundation, you're not going to end up with a fantastic house no matter how much time you spend. You can only scale what you have. And while everybody will say, well, a company's huge, you have to start at scale, you actually don't. The way to do this is to start small, build something that works, add more teams that work, get them working together, and then keep moving. This is one that drives me absolutely insane. And I'm going to have a couple of birds on different levels of this one. Popularity does not make a framework fit for purpose. Just because everybody is using it doesn't mean everybody else should. Again, people come in saying, oh, you have to have small teams. True. If you do Scrum, the tendency is for 10 or fewer people. However, there are teams that can't handle that, that they need additional people. I've seen teams as much as, 25, 50 people be incredibly successful, but they weren't exactly successful in Scrum. So while small teams is a good thing to aim for, if you can't make it work, don't force it to work. This is another one. I want this one on a t-shirt. Scrum is not training wheels for Agile. And I think I may have another one in there. No, it's not the next one. I may have them out of order. You don't have to start with Scrum. Scrum isn't number one. It's not tick box number one. It's just a thing that, if it's fit for purpose, can help. In addition, Kanban's not more difficult than Scrum. A lot of people say that because Scrum is so laid out and so detailed, and you can, do the roles, do the meetings, sorry, do the events, do the things, that it's okay, and that somehow Kanban is this Wild West free for all. But it's really not. My children used Kanban when they were little to help with their chores and their, daily things like brushing your teeth. It's not difficult at all. People make it difficult, but it doesn't have to be. This is another one. Now, all the scaling things that come in say, oh, you've got to do quarterly plans and big room planning and all this other stuff. And while, yes, taking companies who do, 1 and 3 year plans and make that commitments and try to plan it all up front, getting them to something more quarterly is better. But what people don't understand is that for the same reason a Scrum team can't guarantee they're going to deliver every single thing that they commit to focus on in a sprint, and that's, less than a month, the further out you go in planning, the more likely you are to not hit those commitments. Quarterly plans are not commitments to deliver, they're commitments to focus. And if that's not what companies are selling to you and telling your people, it's going to get a whole lot of people into a predicament where, as humans, we can't really predict things. And when we don't meet them, that becomes a point of blame, when in reality, it should be something to celebrate, because 9 times out of 10, things are going to change in those quarters. And we didn't really necessarily want to commit to all of it. Conformity does not equal alignment. Lockstep has the exact opposite effect on people that Agile does. When everyone has to do the same thing at the same time, I've seen companies go so far as to start week 1 of the calendar year as sprint 1 that goes for 2 weeks, and then sprint 2 is the next 2 weeks, and they make every single team do the same thing at the same time. Only nobody ever removes dependencies. Nobody ever talks about the reality of doing this. And what you end up with is people, instead of becoming more aligned because they're doing the same things at the same time, they actually now have no time to become aligned because they can't go to each other's meetings and share information because they're all too busy sticking to the conformed schedule. This is one that hurts too. Agile is not a push system. You're not supposed to force people into things. You're not supposed to push work at them. It's supposed to be a beautiful pull system where people understand what they're capable of doing, what they might be capable of together, and then being able to pull in the most important work. But most of the things that are being sold as Agile are really only focused on the processes and tools, and they don't set people up for success. As a coach, I used to go into companies and be asked to help assess where they were and to help bring them suggestions to help them get where they might be, whatever those dreams were, whatever it was they were thinking about they wanted to become, whatever challenges they wanted to tackle. But now it's just come in, set us up in sprints, set us up in squads, do our thing, and then be done with you. It's a really strange dynamic. Another thing I've heard pretty frequently is that it's our job to move the Agile agenda forward. What is the Agile agenda? There's nothing. I don't want to move anything forward. I don't want to move people or change people. I want to show them that by understanding their work, they may want to change things. They may be able to get, better working arrangements with dependent teams, better working arrangements with their customers, whatever that is. There's no agenda for us to push. When people want us to push agendas, they typically tell us we have to create alignment by coming up with their playbooks or their frameworks. There are some companies that say that we're supposed to go in and create a custom framework for them and then roll it out. Only again, I don't care who makes up the framework, even experienced agilists. You could have the 50 best agilists on the planet sit in a room, and you can't have them come up with something that's going to make people agile unless it's co-built with the people who want to be agile. Checklist. I can't tell you how many times I've been to companies where people are handed a slide deck or, 3 or 4 pages of a document that tell them exactly what to do. Set up this cadence in your calendar, set up this meeting in your calendar, have this it boggles the mind. It makes no sense, but here we are. This is the newest one that has plagued me for about the last 3 or 4 years. Every company that I go to says that they have a capacity management problem or that nobody has fast enough velocity and that managing individual capacity is what's going to get them there. So they spend weeks, sometimes months, putting individual names in an Excel spreadsheet or an incredibly expensive tool that says, 0.3 of their time is going to be spent here, or 75% of their time is going to be spent here. And they spend so much time trying to figure all this out that what they don't realize is that if they could just ruthlessly prioritize and have people working on the most important thing at a time and not 20 things at once, having people on 3 or 4 different teams and trying to find those tiny little percentages of people's capacity, they would actually have the capacity to get things done. Another one that is the bane of my existence. Changing someone's title to Agile coach does not make them an Agile coach. It's a beautiful thing to aspire to. I know many people who've been tapped on the shoulder to be coaches that have gone on to become coaches. But being a coach means you've got to have training in business. You've got to have an understanding of people and how they work. You've got to understand adult learning. You've got to understand how to train. You've got to understand how to facilitate. You've got to understand how to coach. You've got to understand how to think on your feet, how to make unpalatable decisions palatable. There are just so many things that take years and years and years to learn. But because people for the longest time now have wanted the playbooks and the op models and all this stuff that makes it seem easy, they just throw people out to coach and teach and train things that they simply don't understand. Um, does anybody here just throw it into chat for me so I can see it later? Does anybody work in a company that actually calls teams instead of squads? I'd love to know. Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this. If somebody tells you to reorganize based on something they've seen at another company, why would you believe them? Does anybody think that there are any two companies out there, even if you're in the same industry, you're not the same. You've got completely different people. You've got completely different tech. You've got entirely different cultures. You've got different people from different companies, different parts of the world, different skill sets that are building that culture. There's no possible way anyone could know how to rearrange you, reorganize you, or give you something that you need without knowing who you are first. Agile coaches do not enforce processes. The last 7 or 8 places that I've been, part of my job, as I've been told it, I won't do this, is to enforce the processes. Well, what's the first value of the Agile Manifesto? If I remember correctly, it's individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And yet, every consulting company that comes in with their flavor of agility, the first thing they do is enforce process. Oh, this is another one. The focus for Agile coaches, we're not supposed to be standardizing ways of working. Again, it's not about lockstep. I know that a lot of managers feel a bit of a loss of control when they try to do agility for real. And it is a little bit like that. It is a bit of a Wild West free for all while people try to figure themselves out. But they've got to have that time to learn who they are and fix some challenges and grow. You can't just plop a framework and woo, your velocity is going to increase. You're delivering more value to customers. It doesn't work that way. And when you start standardizing people, you stifle all innovation, you stifle agility, you get people into a situation where they don't want to ask questions if things aren't going well, because they know that what they're expected to do is just conform. We can't deliver transformational change. It's impossible for small numbers of people who do not have a stake in the game to force people to change. And even the ones that do, that can waltz into a company and 18 months later go, we delivered transformational change. What do you think the people who come in after them find? Yeah, what they find is a broken system, people who don't want to change anymore because the change was forced. And people either do one of two things. They go back to what they did before, or a lot of times they devolve even further behind. Yeah, we talked about this a little earlier. You just don't have to start with Scrum. Almost everybody that I talk to starts there, and nobody that I've met recently understands that you don't have to. And these are people who call themselves coaches, and these are people who work for consultancies that sell this stuff. They're like, no, this is baby steps. You got to start there. When I finally do get into groups where people will say, okay, we can entertain the idea that Kanban might be better for some people. They're not our tech teams, they're maybe support or someone else. They're like, oh, okay, I can handle this. But then again, they want to make every single board identical. They want every single team to work in the exact same way. Only no matter how many times I show them, I've had groups of people, groups of teams that worked on the exact same product, and even though they were all sharing an initial backlog, none of them worked the same way. But so many managers want them to, and so many consultants sell the idea that you have to. Scrum teams, Scrum teams are Scrum teams. There's a guide that tells us how to do Scrum. There's one product owner. The worst I've seen was 5 product owners, and 2 of them were actually line managers. You can imagine how productive these poor souls were. This is another one that drives me bonkers. Velocity is not a mandatory metric. It's not a mandatory metric in Scrum. It's not a mandatory thing in any aspect of agility. And yet, not only do consultants love to sell velocity and story points, they actually sell them incorrectly, which makes things even worse. I usually try not to call out names, but the fact is, being a Jira admin, being a Jira expert is not a Scrum Master accountability. It is not an Agile coach accountability. And if I had any say in it, I would never tell a single company ever anywhere in the world to use that tool, because at a certain point, even though if it's strictly Scrum, strictly well done Scrum, it can be helpful, it will stifle agility in the long run because it's unable to surpass basics. There's no such thing as agile software. There's a lot of agile software. And in fact, there's a piece of software that I really love that has changed their name to something that has agile in it. And it just makes me want to cry because there's no such thing. The right tool in the right hands, used the right way, can aid in agility, can aid in transparency, can aid in alignment, can aid in all sorts of wonderful things. But in and of itself, software is not agile. It's just a tool. Because a lot of people end up being forced into starting at scale, they tell Scrum teams that during your big room plannings or your PI plannings, you're going to pre-plan all those sprints for the next quarter. And then they go into a tool like Jira and they've got all these sprints pre-planned. Only it can be detrimental to metrics. It can give people a false sense of security that what they're planning is actually going to happen. It becomes a place where management can look and say, oh, well, those were the commitments you said you were going to deliver to and you didn't do them. It creates so many problems that it actually creates more problems than it solves. So I try to tell people never to pre-plan them. This was another fun one. Scrum teams are small teams that work towards a common goal cross-functionally and get things done. Leadership teams, portfolio teams, things like this, they should never be Scrum teams. If everybody in a group is working on different things with different goals, it's not a Scrum team. I had one company that I worked with, one small consultancy, and they convinced that the portfolio team that they needed this. They appointed the CEO as the Scrum Master and told him all these things he was responsible for. Only he was triple and quadruple booked every day, so he never actually showed up to any of the meetings. Nobody really saw him for months at a time. It just can't work. It's not about practicing what you preach. Scrum is suited for certain people at certain times, and it's not fit for purpose absolutely everywhere. Another one that you don't see a lot with people who are really good at Scrum, and you don't see it with really good Agile coaches, but oh my God, do I see it in the consultant-led nonsensical op models, that retrospectives are simply the three questions. What'd you do yesterday? What'd you do today? What are you doing tomorrow? And yeah, for a while, I think it might have even been in the Scrum Guide, but the fact is, it doesn't get to the heart of what you're doing. Oh, sorry, retrospectives with, what went well, what didn't, what are we going to do next? If you do the same repetitive things over and over and over, people aren't going to get anything out of it. I see teams all the time going, yeah, well, we're on like, sprint 50 and we just don't have anything else to learn. And that's because they've stifled themselves again. They're conforming for the sake of conforming, but they're not having the right conversations. Another common one is that Scrum Masters are told to be the team secretaries. They're told that they have to facilitate every single meeting. They're told that they have to run the Jira board for everyone, that they're in charge of writing all the things and assigning the tickets out. And this just couldn't be further from the truth. They're also not project managers. So often when people try to get into doing Scrum, they end up in a situation where they don't have enough Scrum Masters because, as I mentioned earlier, there just aren't that many. And so then they turn around and they say, well, the project managers can just do that. That's just an extra accountability for them. The challenge is they're looking at two completely different things. Your Scrum Masters are focused on the team and how they work together and how they work with others. And your project managers or your product owners or whoever else they've got in charge of projects and products, they're focused on the work. And when those two things clash, they're going to go with the one that they're most familiar with. And that's not always what's best for teams. As I mentioned earlier, with changing people's title to Agile coach, this happens everywhere else too. Changing somebody's title to fit an op model often lands with people who don't have the skills that they need. People land in people leader roles that they don't know how to do. People get targeted to be product owners when they don't have any skill in products, or developers get tagged to be scrum masters and they don't know how to do that and they feel like it's getting in the way of their jobs. All of this stuff isn't going to fix the existing challenges that made people want to move to agility in the first place. This is one of the biggest ones that I see neglected all the times. Many teams never have access to their customers. Either their product owners are told that they're not supposed to allow the team access to customers, that they're supposed to be the buffer, or companies say, oh, our developers just aren't those type of people. They don't need to know their customers. And it doesn't matter if those customers are internal stakeholders or external. Teams have no idea who they're building things for and why. And so often that leads them to simply do things based on their own preconceived notions or their own biases. But when you actually get teams out there into the wild talking with customers, something happens and they become better at building products because they're not thinking about their dev skills. They're not thinking about their team. They're starting to think about who it is they're building these for, why might they need them, and how they can make things better for them. And that's a completely different dynamic that I think consultants overlook. The focus, again, is not on the processes and tools, and yet every single agile transformation that I see being put into place, the first thing they focus on is processes and the tools. This one gets really interesting because everyone always talks about getting better and, finding better ways to work, but there's no such thing as agile best practices. There are a lot of really good practices. There are a lot of things that we've all seen be successful in a lot of different places, but there's no such thing as best. And when we see teams working the same way, next year that they were the year before, that that's the kind of things that they're following. They're thinking, we made these changes, we're here, this is the best way. But work changes, tech changes, people change. And the whole key to knowing when teams are agile is when they know that they're not done yet. Yeah, changing only your ways of working, it's not going to help you solve your problems. I walked into a company one time that had been doing Agile for about 2 years. And all of a sudden, management was wondering why nothing had really changed, why they weren't delivering any better, they weren't delivering any faster, they were still having challenges, they were still plagued with tech debt. And when I started asking questions, I realized nobody had ever told them how to grow. Nobody ever taught them how to evolve. All they taught them was how to conform to the playbook or the op model, and that was supposed to solve everything. There's no such thing as an agile scrum framework. Every single day, I will look at job ads. I will look at people's LinkedIn profiles to see what's happening. And there's just new stuff being thrown around. There's new things happening that make absolutely no sense. So for me, it's always kind of a clue as to what a company's going to be like if I go to work for them based on the job description they had me take a look at. This is partially because of the book that came out years ago. Um, but really, doing Scrum, being agile, moving towards more agile ways of working, none of this guarantees faster delivery. Faster delivery is based on your tech, the skills of your people, the culture that you're in, the way management treats people, the way management prioritizes work. There's so many factors that go in. And yet often I see people who've been, they've been sold agility and they're expecting all of this faster, faster, faster and more delivery, and they don't get it and they don't understand why. Again, story points, not mandatory. And heaven forbid, if they're in hours and days, they're going to be just completely pointless. Just because some teams use Scrum or Kanban or XP or any other thing that they want to do does not mean everybody has to. Everybody doesn't work the same way. Why would anybody expect a marketing team to work exactly the same as an HR team, or to have the same responsibilities as a data analyst team, or even tech teams in an organization? They can work on completely different tools. They can work on completely different types of work with absolutely different audiences. There's no way to have a one size fits all that's ever going to work for anyone. This one goes back to the tool that shouldn't be used. The words epics and features are not mandatory. There are teams that need to break down their work in more granular ways. There are some teams that do not. They can have just big chunks of work and they can call them anything that they want. But locking people into language, calling it agile, it's really confusing, because then when someone finds the need to stray from the mandatory or the thing that everybody else does, it can feel really bad. It can feel like they weren't good enough to do it the way everyone else did. It's not a good thing to define how people have to refer to things. It's not a good idea if your agile transformation comes with a glossary that people must follow. One of the beauties about Kanban is that it's based on flow. It's based on however long it takes today for the work to flow through the system. That's how the work flows. Eventually, your data is going to show you ways to make it better. But because of fun things like SAFe and all the fake agile frameworks that are being forced into the wild by some of the big consultancies, you now have Kanban teams forced to work in sprints. And worse, forced to work in 2 week sprints. It's a Kanban team. And I can't tell you how many times I tried to educate people that it's actually detrimental to them. But yeah, the consultants are paid a whole lot more than I am. So, who are you going to believe? The person charging you 24 mil or the person barely getting by? Mm. Yeah, managers are not supposed to dictate the rate at which teams work. Every single company that I go into, I find teams where they're struggling to fit into 2 week sprints. They're struggling to break their work down. And a lot of times it turns out the work can't be broken down anymore unless they do it by, BA work, dev work, test work, whatever else it is. But when managers come in and say everybody has to work at the same rate, they're actually destroying the morale of many, many people. And this is one of the quickest ways to lose tech talent. It's not just for maintenance as support. And one of the people that is most influential around the world with introducing Kanban to the world in many, many really good ways says it, and says that it's not fit for purpose in a chaotic environment. And yet it's one of the most beautiful things in the world for a chaotic environment, because it is something that reflects reality first and foremost. You're not going to find say you have a hurricane in the South in the United States, and they put together a task force to go in and help a town get back on its feet. I guarantee you they're not doing Scrum. They're doing some form of Kanban, some form of an Obeya, and they're getting through the chaos that way. It's not just for maintenance as support teams. Children can use it. Adults can use it to plan vacations, home remodels. It's an amazing system for looking at reality and figuring out what you can do better. Team boards are there for people to see what they have going on, to be able to inspect what they do, how they do it, to be able to build some metrics behind it to see it. I once had a company where I think it was 5 or 6, maybe 7 teams. And this was back in the days when we put boards on walls. And I talked to every single team. I talked about who they were, how they worked, what they wanted to see, how they needed to communicate. And I got them to build boards for their teams. And the next thing I know, one of the managers comes to the floor and starts yelling at everybody, telling them that she doesn't understand why all these boards look different. Everybody needs to work the same way. And fortunately, I hadn't just told them what to do, they built it themselves. And so they were able to go in and say, well, this is why we're doing this, so that we can see this information, so you can see this information, so you don't have to have a meeting with us. And when she finally got around to the last team, she finally got it. But so often teams don't get there, and um, they don't have the safety to be able to speak out like that. And so they end up having to conform. And then you've got teams that are just kind of going through the motions and never getting to see the reality behind their work that could actually help them improve. It doesn't mandate breaking all work into tasks. Yes, that's a huge thing, especially in something like Scrum, because you want work small enough to get through those small iterations. And while Kanban teams eventually do sometimes learn to break their work down, the reality is it's not mandatory, and they don't have to start with. I've seen teams that will actually break their work down for a small amount of time, and once they have a good understanding and they've tweaked their system enough, they'll actually go back to the bigger chunks because it just makes it a little more manageable. So the ability to be able to do what you need is so fundamental to Kanban. And so often they get mandated how to do their work in a system that only wants, one op model. It's not just for co-located teams. I've worked with international teams pretty much since the beginning of my career. Back in the days where we didn't have laptops and cameras and any kind of whiteboards or murals to share. We did quite well. And all we did was we would build boards on a wall. We would send a photograph, or we would put in an email or an Excel spreadsheet what that looked like. The people on the other side would recreate it. There's always a way to find alignment without needing to conform and be co-located. It's definitely not just for service delivery teams. I think I've mentioned anybody can use this anytime. I use it personally. My entire family has personal boards. This is another one that gets really talked about lately, and that's culture. But we can't install it. We can't make people's culture change. All we can do is help influence. Another couple of quick ones. Just every PBI should not be a user story. Epics do not need to be in user story format. Every single thing doesn't have to be, as a developer, I want to do this so that. User stories are just stories from users that can be done. It's a great little format to remind people that they have customers and what their needs are, but they're not mandatory. Everything cannot be priority one. So often the biggest challenge I see in companies is that they don't know how to prioritize across a company. They prioritize in silos, and nobody ever comes in with their op models and teaches them how to prioritize properly. Couple of real quick last ones. Actually, we're running out of time, aren't we? I'll get through these pretty quick.
It's okay. You have time, Sally.
So there's no such thing as an agile change manager. That's become a new buzzword, and I get it. Agile change does need some change management. There are some things that are going to change that need to be communicated to an entire company. But again, agile isn't a thing. It's not a tick box exercise. You can't just manage a rollout of something that can't be rolled out. I think I've probably talked about this one quite a bit, and that's that nothing about agility should be mandated. If a team doesn't want to do it, They shouldn't be made to. Because the fact of the matter is, if you work with teams and you can start helping them do things that make them feel better, other teams will want to do it too. There's no reason to force it. Big thing with the scaling frameworks is everybody says you've got to map your dependencies, map your dependencies, map your dependencies. But what nobody ever talks about is how to get rid of them. Mapping them doesn't eliminate them and it doesn't help anything. It just makes the pain even more apparent. People often talk about forcing people into using tools like Jira, saying that, well, you have to have the metrics because the metrics matter. Yeah, they do, but they're not the whole story. In fact, I was with a company that had done a nice big merge and people had tons of different things, tons of different overlapping tools from these original companies that they hadn't quite merged yet. And the management kept screaming at me because the consultants that were on staff were saying, we have to get metrics for the teams. We have to get metrics. And I said, but their systems are broken. The metrics are just going to tell you they're broken. Let's just talk to them and fix their challenges. Everybody wants to have the metrics on paper, but they don't really understand that the metrics are only there to serve everyone in helping the teams. Again, with scaling, now OKRs are all the rage again, and quarterly plannings are all the rage. And everybody's saying, OKRs have to be tied to quarterly planning. You're going to get these done in the quarter. Absolutely not. Sometimes OKRs are going to take years. The whole point of an OKR is to give you something to focus on that's related to your customer, that's related to the value you bring them. If it happens to be small enough that you can do it in a quarter, fantastic. But if it's not, don't try to force it. OKRs are meant to be aspirational. So many consultants that I've worked alongside try to sell them as things that must be met. They'll actually build forms and tools that show you how to hold people accountable for making OKRs. But again, they're the pie in the sky. We're going to send someone to the moon things. May or may not happen. They're not meant to be met. And the last one is that it is not necessary for teams to report the results of their retrospectives. And this also means it's not only retrospectives, it's also their sprint reports. These aren't for anybody else's consumption. These are for the team, and that's all there is to it. And the more you try to force people to share, the more management looks at teams differently for the things that are wrong rather than the things that are great. That is me. Thank you for joining me for that. This is a slide that'll tell you a little bit more about how to get in touch with me. At sallysloley.com is where you can actually find every single one of my birds that are out there. They're flying around waiting. I have decided to do a book. I have just finished the first draft and I am on the hunt for a publisher. Also on my website is the page that will have all the details as those emerge. I threw in a few more birds that'll be available when you get when you download the slides. And that's it for me.